Hey Fabian, thanks for jumping on the call. To give a little bit of context, we actually started this in a another thread, so I'll just do a super quick recap. On the CI/CD team, we had some challenges where we have the stack rank going into planning, and what's happening then is that on the planning day, basically the engineering manager is going through the stack rank on the way down and kind of like dealing it out like a deck of cards.
Yeah.
So one engineer gets one, next engineer gets one, and we work our way down the stack rank until all the engineers say, okay, I feel full. And that ends up being the cut line where we work. And that part actually works great. It ensures that the top items move and that we get a pretty clear cut line because everybody has like a good sense of specific items that they're going to be working on. But then what comes out of that is that all of the context from the stack rank is lost. So we go into development and people just work on whichever ones seem to make sense to them or whatever. And in theory, the engineering manager can kind of remember the stack rank and help people stay on task within engineering. But in practice, that's really, really hard to do because there's so many items. And so we were looking at the Geo process, which uses a Kanban board, which is nice because it limits WIP, both in terms of the delivery side and in terms of kind of queuing up the next work to be done.
Yes.
So people are always just pulling the top thing off the stack rank, which sounds great. And I was wondering, does the problem that I described make sense? Is that why you all implemented a Kanban board, was to solve that problem? Do you think that this would help us?
So this process started a few months ago, and I think one of the problems that we faced in Geo was that sort of at the beginning of the release cycle, right, of the month, essentially I would create a long list of issues, which was roughly stack ranked, right, and say like, this is the stuff I think makes sense to deliver in the next month. And I think the observation was that like reality at the end of the month would look pretty different. For various reasons, right? Like other things pop up, right? Like people like need to like jump on like customer issues, whatever it may be. So there was a disjoint. Also, folks didn't have enough context, right? It's like they were sort of individual issues that, maybe at the time when I scheduled them, it made sense, right? But people were not really able to, I think, really fully understand what was happening. And there was also then like just one big board, right? And I think it was a little bit overwhelming to have this long list of stuff. And also for Rachel and myself, Rachel is the engineering manager I work with, we felt that we had sort of a very hectic 1 week where we needed to do all the planning, we needed to think about the milestone and kind of get all of this done. And then you have this sort of big relief moment. It's like, we are done now. Now, like we can go off and do other things and the team can deliver. That didn't work out so well. So Rachel suggested to do a more continuous process, which is the Kanban process. So essentially the idea was that we would do a couple of things differently to make it work. So we have essentially this sort of dual track system where there is a planning process, which I can talk about a little bit, and then there is the actual sort of build process, and they're being linked by the sort of scheduling step, which is, I call it the Geo special, right? It's essentially what happens is the build board is relatively lean, right? So it contains all the items that the engineering team is working on. So it has the workflow labels, and I can actually pull this up right now so you can see it. Just find. So this is the current build board, and you'll have the usual workflow, right? Verification in review, blocked in dev, ready for development, and this sort of open column here. But I can actually close this. So this is where engineers essentially should look like to grab new work from the workflow ready for development. And this is roughly stack ranked. So the most important next thing to do should be at the top. And at the moment you can see, and this is probably a function of where we are in the release, there's a lot of work in development and not very much in review right now. So it kind of makes sense. But you can also see here, these are sort of the closed items that were delivered this week. And for, like, let's say our engineering team, they don't need to go anywhere else, right? This is where people can go and say, like, okay, what's the next thing to do? And they can more or less freely pick from the ready for development column. And there will usually not be more than, let's say, five to 7, 8 items, right? Because we try to keep it at a sort of a 1 week wait, let's say. And we use weights as in one point is roughly one ideal working day. So as you can say, like, see, at the moment it's pretty lean. And how we decide to actually pull in issues here is a part of our scheduling call that Rachel and I have synchronously every Friday. Yeah. So we meet for an hour, and the first thing we do is we essentially go through the state on the build board and actually say, are things moving? You know, are there like certain blockers? Are we still doing the right thing? Do we need to change something? And then the next bit is essentially saying, do we still have enough work for the team for the next week to actually continue, or do we need to schedule new work? Right. And the scheduling step is in a different board here, where this is essentially my backlog, right? Like, this is items that are like broken down into iterations. They are weighted, right? They are essentially ready to be picked up by engineering. And ideally, this long list here is also more or less stack ranked. I struggle with this a little bit because I can't see my epics, right? I have no swim lanes, so it is just a big pile. But this is essentially like 59 days of engineering time that I know could happen more or less right now. And what we then do is we go through this, and I essentially sort of pre-select a number of items and say, hey, actually, we still need to create the server architecture diagram, right? I think this is something we should do next. I also think we should organize this meeting here and do those things. And Rachel and I have a discussion every week if, you know, she understands, you know, what this means, if it is well enough defined, right? If this sort of makes sense as a package, and then we go ahead and schedule it. Okay. So that's that.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The one question that I have is, so on the last board, there was the open column. What are those items? That's what I had initially assumed must be your kind of like preparation area.
Yeah, we do a little bit of trickery here because the issue boards don't work well for us. So you can see when you pull something over from my sort of stack ranked priority pile, right? It gets applied this geoactive label. Right? And this is how we filter our boards to remain relatively small. Because if you just have no label at all, it will give you all 578 open items that are labeled group geo.
Right.
Essentially, like this year, the build board has this sort of active label.
So those 4 items are the 4 items that are in the open column here.
That's exactly right.
Okay, that's very cool.
Right, and and this is also kind of the trick to implement our dual track agile, because my plan board has the geo planning step attached to it. Right? So, you know, I can also move it through sort of the plan phase into the like active phase, which is for
right.
Yeah.
The other question that I have is how this interacts with the monthly release cycle and the kickoff in particular. So I know you're using epics, and that's sort of even a different element to it. Yeah. But setting epics aside, the on the, you know, whatever day the kickoff is, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. We have to know roughly where the cut line is. So like when I was talking about my process where engineering breaks it down and like gets a very accurate cut line, I use that then to know roughly what's going to make it in the kickoff. Yeah. With this process, it seems like you're more doing that as the milestone progresses. So how do you know what the cut line is? And also, who makes the call? Is it the engineering manager, or like who's deciding what the cut line is for what's included in the kickoff?
So I do this. I mean, I think this is actually one of the big challenges, because this machinery here is essentially continuous, right? It never really stops, right? It just continues ideally, right? And we deliver things at different points in the month, right? So for example, let's say I have hope that one of my my epics that didn't actually make it into 12.4 will be done in, let's say, a week or so, right? So then, you know, I'm pretty confident that that will make it. For other things, it's quite hard to tell. So one thing that I do that is a poor sort of indicator for this is the sort of the geo, I think it's the roadmap view. I need to look at it. Yes. So I use this a little bit, where essentially I look at the different milestones and I just wiggle around sort of the weighting, you know, of items, and you can see I'm behind. You know, this is an unfortunate reality right now, where I know already, you know, we have these 37 things that I have already applied the milestone to, right? And I hope we're going to deliver them, but it may not really be feasible. So it is a little bit more difficult to know what is going to be in or not. And yeah, I think the other problem that I have is that I feel that these individual issues are, they're not really something I like to necessarily talk about, right? Because I think they are a little bit, they're very technical, right? And I think I'd rather talk about a larger like piece of work that has many like very small issues associated with them. And the timeline for delivering this may be different than our release timeline, right? It may only be 2 weeks, or it could be maybe 6 weeks. And so what I need to do is I need to, as a product manager, I kind of need to align this and say, how can I still release things in a more or less continuous fashion and not sort of have sort of big spurts, or, you know, like balance it out a little bit. Right. I think this is one of the challenges with this, right? Because our release timeline at the moment is aligned to our product development timeline. Yeah. And to a certain extent, the process we use in Geo is decoupled, right? It's like because it's continuous, like things can happen like throughout the entire month. And then what I essentially do, and that's kind of similar to what happened with you, is let's say a week before the actual release, I have a pretty good understanding of where we are, like with regards to some of the sort of the deliverable epics. And I can then speak with Rachel and say, like, we are pretty confident that this is going to actually make it. You know, I write my release post item, right? And then that turns out to be okay. But it's a challenge. I haven't really figured out the milestone stuff yet. And I'm also conscientious that, for example, the way we work here and the absence of being able to, for example, include epics in the kickoff document means that I highlight a bunch of issues, you know, where I feel a little bit like they don't really have the full context.
Right. Huh. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this could help us, and maybe we could play around with some different ideas for how we put the cut line. It does feel to me a little awkward to have product figuring out like what the engineering capacity is. But yeah, maybe it's okay.
I didn't really like. I don't really do this, right? I think we still have alignment in the team on like what we want to do next, right? And what we are going to do on a higher level.
I mean, for the kickoff, when
the kickoff,
what's
but also if you compare like historically, like I've seen like my kickoff items are very short, right? Usually I have like 2 or 3 things in there that are, you know, like more chunky, like, well, I don't want to give the impression as if we don't iterate, right? But it is not a long list of things, right? It's often sort of a higher level statement.
Right.
And I think that I can do, right? The actual sort of implementation and like scoping of things, that is definitely up to engineering, and I wouldn't want to interfere.
Yeah, maybe that makes sense. Take the direction label off of so many things that we're doing now and focus on like the bigger, clear deliverables that are worth talking about, and maybe that can help balance that. The kickoff then doesn't need to be quite as accurate in terms of down to the issue what you're going to be delivering.
Yeah, and I think there's also options. Like I can give you one example where we had a very large effort to revamp parts of our documentation,
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't actually get through all issues for this epic for the 12.4 release. And then I had a discussion with engineering and said like, okay, let's downscope, and like, is what we have already something that we can talk about and delivers customer value and we want to actually write about? And we agreed. And then we said like, okay, this is fine. Let's actually like say, yes, this is what it is. And the other things can come a little bit later. So
yeah, it's nice.
But I think honestly, from my perspective, the most like powerful thing, and like this is sort of implementation, I think, right? It's how you do it. But I think the thing that makes it work at the moment, at least for us, is it well, forces is a strong word, but it encourages strong alignment between the engineering manager and myself.
Yeah.
Rachel and I like talk to each other every week. So let's say 4 hours a month at least about this, right?
Right.
And so I think that's actually really powerful, because we've had quite a few instances in the past where we set out to do something and it turned out to be really not a good idea, right? Or maybe too large, or like whatever it was. And then we could course correct pretty quickly. Right. And I think that's really nice. I enjoy that a lot.
Yeah, and I like that the stack rank continues and is continually adjusted. I think that's another key piece here.
Yeah, because we also often get, or not often, but sometimes you get customer issues, right? Where folks are having some trouble with something, and I want to be in a position where I can say, this is really highly like important right now to do, and have the liberty to have the team work on this relatively quick without sort of disrupting all of the other things, right?
Right.
Because that was, I think, one of the main issues where if you are essentially already sort of scoped to capacity for a month, and then like folks come and say like, hey, you also need to do this and this and this, then figuring out what drops becomes really hard.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. We'll share this around internally and probably post it to Unfiltered if that's okay with you. And this definitely sounds like something we could try out in the CI/CD area. So
and I think it's actually, I mean, that would be great. Let me know if you need any help. But I think it's also for you and your team, it would be really cool, because this is essentially a continuous delivery pipeline, in issues. And I think it aligns super well with actually being able to deliver continuously as well. So
I was really lucky when Kanban was first coming out. At the company that I was at, we brought out David Anderson, and so got like David Anderson to consult on us implementing Kanban. It was really, really cool. Anyway, I'm a fan.
I need to cruise.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for reaching out. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.